Hi, Vincent Hall, and welcome to another episode of Anyone Can Draw, Paint, and Create. As promised, today is our fourth and final installment on the ages. We've done collage, montage. Last week was frottage, which, in case you don't remember, was doing all of the rubbings with something underneath your paper. Well, today we're going to do the last of them, which is grattage. Grattage and frottage are sometimes interchanged in the painting world, and Max Ernst was a heavy user of both of these techniques, and we talked about Ernst last week as well because he did a lot of surrealist things. And if you recall, I used my sage leaf and turned it into a forest using the frottage method that Max Ernst had used extensively. Today we're going to do grattage. Grattage is basically putting something on top of the surface and scraping it away or blotting off to create texture. Now, if you recall, we've used sponges for some of those same techniques back when we were doing more drawing and painting combination. So I'm going to show you how it works in its pure form with paint, and then I'm going to show you how it can work for a drawing. Now, many of you have both paint and drawing supplies at home, and you're welcome to try it with either one. I'm going to start with acrylic paint, just some samples using just primary colors to give you a rough idea of where I'm going with this. And then I'm going to do an actual drawing using frottage and then using my water-soluble pencils. And I'm going to use subject matter that's near and dear to me, the corn husk. When I was going to undergraduate school in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, there were a lot of cornfields near where the art center was. So I was always interested in drawing those corn stalks as they started to dry in the fall. And we're at that time of year, so I thought that might be kind of fun to try. And I'll be showing you the image I'm working with in a little bit as well. Let's get started. As you can see, I pre-stained a canvas, well, most of the way down, using yellow paint, just so that you can get a sense of what a toned surface looks like using grattage, because we're going to be using blue drawing paper when I go to drawing on this project. If you want to follow along with a corn husk, that's fine, or you want to try your own topic, subject matter, please feel free. This is just a sample. I'm going to show you what aluminum foil does when it's crinkled up. We're going to use a t-shirt, we're going to use paper towel, and then my favorite, plastic wrap. Let's see how this might work. So here's my canvas, and what I'm going to do is just take a little bit of a different color. Actually, I'm going to mix two because I want to use some of this green. So I'm just going to take some blue and some yellow together and just kind of dab these around to get a greenish color. Probably darker is better, just to give a sense of what this grattage can do for a texture of a cornstalk. So I'm just going to paint here. And the idea, if you're doing this with painting, use a relatively thick amount of paint. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and go full on mixing it on my canvas because we want to kind of keep this somewhat thick that we can try some different textures. And you can see my brush is making a texture in and of itself. So I'll start with my favorite, which is the plastic wrap. And the idea is to just lay this down. The more crinkled it is, the better. And once this is down, we got to let it dry. So I'm going to let this just sit here while I show you some of the other techniques. If we pull it off too soon, the wet paint is just going to fill right back in and we won't get any kind of a surface. We can also weight this down with something. If you had a book, that would be a good idea, but you don't have to worry about that. Let's try some other lesser textured techniques, but something else that you can see. So I'm just going to paint some red in here. This is not going to be any one thing. I'm not doing the corn stalks on this. This is just samples. And on this one, I'm going to take a little piece of a t-shirt, just wad it up. And this might look more familiar to you. It's just blotting. And you can see how you can create some interesting textures and even coming out along the surface to get some really nice blotting ideas. Again, that's what grattage is. It's creating a texture via a blotting. I'm going to use my paper towel to clean off my brush. I'll just take some plain old blue This is really bad blue. This blue is a lot like our Art Center blue. It's all chunky. So if you've ever been down the Art Center, you know how I really get mad at that blue, but I guess I have the same thing at home. It sort of has a dried out look. Here is a really thick area of blue, trying to make this as matte as I can. And on this one, we're gonna try some crinkled up aluminum foil. Again, the more crinkly, the more texture. I'm gonna press this down, and I don't have to wait as long with this as the plastic wrap, but I do have to wait a second. Thicker paint, of course, will dry heavier, so it won't be such a problem. And I pull it off, and I can get some beautiful, these look like leaves to me. Here, I'll pick it up so you can see. It's blue, but the interesting thing is how you get this serendipitous look. And then, almost like printmaking, you can take what's left on your piece of aluminum foil or whatever and make a mono print that you could then use as texture to go back in. A lot of the painters that did lace and things like that, and you think, oh my gosh, how did they do all that detail? Well, they laid the lace, like I'm doing this, into the paint, and then they pressed it back down onto the canvas, and lo and behold, they had these very intricate shapes that you could not get by just doing the painting by itself. The beautiful thing of this is you can take one technique, like my blue crinkled aluminum foil, and lay it over another and start to get a myriad of subtle textures, which is really nice too. Q-tips we've done before, but we all know that they will create a texture, and I'm going to use this for the kernels of my corn when I get that far with my drawing. Let's see if this has cured enough to do some good. I'm gonna peel this off, and yes, it has. And you're thinking, why would I want something like that? Well, if I was painting a corn husk, I would exactly want something like this, because we can get some gorgeous techniques by using plastic wrap over paint, and then once again, using it a second time. So you can see I'm starting to create stalks here that I can paint into, and it gives me a very loose, yet a very interesting paint surface from which to work. Now, most times grattage is not used by itself, except for abstract painters, and we'll look at a few of those too. And you might be thinking, abstract painting? No, 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 not for me. Well, I used to think that too, but I was told by a painting professor that I admire that to think of abstract painting as a foreign language that you just don't speak, but that doesn't mean it's not relevant. Makes sense to me. So maybe this is my abstract painting and I could call it a day. But I'm not a famous artist, so that's probably not going to happen. Let's see how grattage will work with a drawing. Before we move on to the drawing, I just wanted to make sure you could understand where I was going with this. So I just worked with a little bit of brushwork in, ignore all of this. Just the idea of what maybe a corn husk would look like using grattage as a paint medium. So if you are a painter slash drawer, or you like to try to draw with paint, which is something people always say, oh, don't draw a painting and don't paint a drawing, but they're interchangeable. You can draw with a brush. You might want to try it. So you can see here's all my grattage texture. This was the Q-tip, this was my plastic wrap, and then I used a little aluminum foil to scratch down through here to get these vertical lines. And I can make something that looks like a corn husk in about 5 minutes, just using some of these simple materials. But as promised, this is primarily drawing, so we're going to see how this works on a drawing surface. Here is the corn husk picture that I decided to use as my inspiration for the project we're going to work with. You can see here on the picture that there is a lot of interesting texture on the corn, and there's one husk here that was allowed to kind of just sit on the stalk. And then we've got all these beautiful variated lines on the corn leaves themselves, on the husks, and how they twist and turn. So this should be a lot of fun. Let's see what we can do. You might remember this piece of cardboard from last time. It's a piece of serrated cardboard. And I wanted to show you how frottage can work in an almost stencil way by coloring in around the edges. This left-hander part of me is going to be a problem, but here we go. And I'm just kind of roughly going over the edge of this, give me a nice kind of interesting little rough texture. And I'm using this to define where I'm going to do my drawing, because I want to kind of keep it more of a square. And this is intentionally rough. I'm not trying to make it perfectly serrated. If you use pastel, you'll get more of the serrated edge. But if you use pencil, it's probably going to be up for grabs. And I'm just trying, let me straighten this out here. Just kind of drag it back and forth along the edges to give yourself an area that you want to work inside of. So this is going to be my format. And we talked about format a few weeks ago, just something with inside the other, but I want to keep it rough because I'm looking at this rustic piece of corn. So a couple of ways to start. First, we can draw in the corn itself. And I showed you a picture of that in the last segment. So I'm just going to roughly draw in about where I want some of these things to go so that then I can add my texture later. There's this interesting piece of corn here. I really like corn stalks because they have all these joints and different segments that add interest, and the leaves change direction and lines so much. It just looks like fun to me. You know, you grow up rural, you find fun in some simpler things. So anyway, here's this other corn leaf here and coming down here. And then leaves are fun because you can follow along the insides, and these corn leaves have so many different areas that I think define their shape. Now here's this little unhusked ear of corn that was allowed to kind of dry on the vine a little bit here, or the stalk rather. And there's a few little tassels that are sort of starting to hang down. And all of this will make more sense once we are filling these areas in. Now I'm going to purposefully not draw in every little leaf in the background of this corn drawing because there's so many that we'll get lost, and I don't want to spend the whole day drawing the corn. I'm just going to do another little, there's a husk under here that I thought was kind of interesting. And this husk is actually lighter. So I'm going to leave this be. This is pretty close to where I want my rough drawing of my corn so that you can get a sense of how frottage works here. Now I have a couple of other textures that I'm going to use, and this is a garbage bag tie. So you might be thinking, seriously, why? And again, it's for the texture. So to do frottage, we're coloring over. This is going to give me some very interesting little edgy textures that I could get, oh, the glare on this. Let me do this a little darker so you can see it. I could get these just by shading them in, but these little things can add some interest, and they also, if you just trace around the edges, are a quick way, and move it over and trace again, to start to get some really interesting details. But we want to see how frottage works with a drawing medium. So we're going to have to get this paper a little bit wet. I'm going to do this half in pencil and then this half in colored pencil, so you can see even just a plain old pencil is going to work with a wet medium. So first, I have to get some darks in. So we're almost going to look at this like it's a tale of two corn husks, because it is two corn husks. And we're going to go pretty dark in here. And then this comes over here. Then this little stalk is pretty dark back in here. Now this leaf has a dark shadow, so I'm just using one pencil. It's a softer lead pencil. So if you want to go pencil with this, I suggest going relatively soft. A hard one is just not going to show up, and it's not going to allow you to remove any of the graphite. And half the battle with grattage is removing what you've already put down. So here we go with this, and then this stalk, a couple of different lines. I'm really just roughing this one in, and I'm going to leave that go and Get a little more graphite in here, up at the top here. Really don't be afraid to go dark. It's kind of like go big or go home with this. So we want to go as dark as we need to. This goes darker up here. Okay. That's pretty good. So we have our darkest areas, but we don't have any grattage yet. We just have some implied texture. So what I'm going to do with this is take a brush with a little bit of water and wet an area of my picture. And you can see if you use graphite, just like those colored pencils, yeah, you can make it wet. So is it still a drawing? Yes, but does it have some interesting textures coming up? We hope so. So we have to go fast. The softer the medium, the softer the texture has to be to go in here. So I'm gonna blot this out, and this is subtle, but I just am getting a very soft texture, which you'll see on the finished project. Now what I'm going to do is color this in ever so lightly, because I want to get some corn in here. Get this wet, move fast, there's no time to let this dry, and take my Q-tip and start to get some textured tones inside here. You have to go pretty hard and you have to go fast, or it's just going to go into a blob, but it is working, believe it or not. I can also use this Q-tip down here. I kind of like that. And then just take another piece of paper and blot this off. So hopefully you were able to see how I got this nice gradient going on here. So I'm using Grattage with just a lead pencil to get some interesting, I'm gonna go really dark here. And I have to be prepared. So I'm going back to some of my plastic wrap, but with my pencil, I'm gonna wet this down and immediately go into it and hold this down. Now, graphite dries really fast because it's powder, so it doesn't take long for this to hold down. I'm just gonna hold it down for a few seconds here, pull it off, and I got this really cool chunky texture. The beauty of grattage is sometimes you don't know what you're gonna get. It's like Forrest Gump and his box of chocolates. So I've got a really nice texture here that I'm gonna draw back into. I'm gonna let this dry. Let's see what this does with color. All right, I laid in some basic colors because we've already done basic shading with colored pencil in many, many episodes. So I just put in some dark greens and light greens. Now I'm gonna go in with the brown to define my shadows a little bit more on this drawing. This one is the corn husk and the ear of corn that was allowed to sort of dry on the corn husk. So I have a lot of shadow on this one as it comes around the edge. And you can see how heavy I'm using my colored pencils. Please don't be afraid to go dark with some of these, especially if you're using a toned paper. It's just gonna make it all that much more interesting. And it's also going to give you more pigment for this grattage to actually turn into something. And again, it's all the art of experiment. There's actually a whole class that I was able to take called experimental drawing, or drawing with non-traditional techniques. And it was really helpful in making you think outside the box. I'm gonna go in lighter on this one here, and I'm even gonna use some white because I'm using toned paper. You've got to use a heavier surface paper with this, or you're not going to be happy with the results, because unlike the Grattage, where we used a very thin piece of computer paper to get the best results, Grattage is going to require a heavier drawing paper in order for you to get something that you might recognize as a textured drawing and that you might want to have. Now, the beauty of a grattage drawing, just like the painting, is that we can go back into it once we've got some of these areas established and redraw things. So don't feel like, let's add this little white thing there because there's something kind of cool going on behind this ear of corn that I didn't see at first. Get the highlight in here. Okay. We just want to get this a little bit darker. And you know, this is also one of those things that you might try it and decide this isn't the technique I want to use, but at least it's a technique you've learned exists. And therein lies the beauty of art, because you might like it later on, you never know, or it might come into play later on. So now I have my medium, and just like before, I'm going to take a small brush and I'm going to wet this one little piece at a time, but I have to plan what do I want to use to lift off the paper on this. So or lift off the pigment rather on the paper. So I'm going to use my paper towel for this one because I just want to get some real scruffy textures in my corn husk. So I'm just wetting the corn husk. This is just plain old color pencil, but be careful where you wet. You don't want to overdo it. And I'm just going to go back in and press some areas out. And this is more blending, but that's okay too, because that way I'm able to get some really soft textures and get rid of those hard edges that I'm going to draw back into, and then use my crinkled plastic wrap. Now for this part, this leaf here is very crinkly. So I'm going to really twist up my plastic wrap, wet just this area, lay this down, and color pencil pigment, being as it wets down a little bit softer than the graphite, it takes a little longer to dry. So I'm just going to hold this down here with my hands for a few more seconds, not minutes. You'd be like, oh no, change the channel. And hopefully as this dries, we'll be able to get something akin to what we're trying to get with the paint. I'm going to pull this off. Oh yeah, that worked beautifully. There we go. So now we have some really nice texture going on in the drawing, whereas before it was just a flat area. I'm just going to be careful. I'm going to go over here, pull it off a little bit. I can use what's left on here. I can wad it up if I want to get some other areas. I think I am going to use it up here. I'm going to get this darker. I really like the darks with these pencils. And then just kind of blot to get a texture. Now I'm not going to leave it like this. I'm going to go back in and actually do my drawing. But this allows me to get really subtle lines and some interesting effects that I wouldn't normally get just with the drawing pencils by themselves. There's another idea that you could use if you're so inclined and you happen to have some paint lying around, which is to take the paint, a little dab of it, and we're only getting just a tiniest little bit of paint here, and use this on your textured surface. In this case, it's my plastic wrap, to kind of go up and down and into these areas to create a bit of a texture that I can then go back over. So you can combine mediums. Now this is becoming a mixed medium drawing, but that's okay too. It'll at least give you an idea, or you can use this to create some texture in your background. Because a lot of times people ask me, well, I don't know what to put in the background. I want it to be something, but I don't know what. So here, we're using a little bit of dried out acrylic paint to just kind of create a soft, neutral background, and where it got a little too blue right there. I kind of like that blue. I'm going to leave it. Serendipity in art is always a good thing. And then I'm just going to take it out where I don't want it, which is right there. And you can see here, we're getting some really nice tonal, kind of almost like that blurred background where you might have a lens on a camera that softens your background. So I'm going to let this dry for a minute and then show you how you can work back into it. So while the paint part's drying, I thought I would play around with doing grattage by using the edge of a paintbrush. This is called a fan brush, and using some wet graphite in segments to create the idea of maybe like some little grassy growths or something back here. So again, we're creating the idea of grattage on a drawing by almost reincorporating a stenciled look. But see, this will also give us an interesting and somewhat varied look to the background. So I'm just using what little bit of graphite I have as I go up among the surface. Oh, I'm really liking that. And then just kind of letting it show through, change the angle a little bit, because I'm just trying to create that interesting, loose, grattage-like texture in the background of this drawing. So once we draw back into it here, we're going to see a nice transition. Hopefully, since we're trying to compare a color drawing to a black and white, that's always a challenge anyway. I just thought I'd share with you where I was going while this dries using the graphite. So this drawing's had a chance to sit here a little bit, get some of the areas on the paper that were wet a bit drier, and I worked back into my graphite with a white colored pencil, which is something you can choose to do or not. But when I'm on a toned surface, I like to think of my color that's the paper as my middle value, and then go light and dark if I'm doing graphite by just white or a graphite pencil. Of course, with colored pencil, everything's up fair game. You can do whichever you want. Now, there's another aspect of grattage, which is almost like an eraser or a removal. So we know if we wet things, it'll blend. If we take a wet paper towel and work back into these areas, I can start to remove some of the pigment. Now, paper is not the same as canvas, so you have to be very careful. But if you wanted to do some beautiful soft areas using this paper towel, that also counts as grattage, because what we're trying to do here, and I know I've gone out of my borders, but I'm going to cut this off anyway, so it doesn't matter, is to remove areas and try to get a softer look. Grattage is all about surface texture, and texture doesn't always have to be rough. Think silk. It can also be very smooth, and I'm just kind of removing some of this here. So the water on a paper towel can almost act like an eraser. I'm just kind of cleaning up some of my edges here a little bit. Even with just the plain graphite, I noticed here I completely lost a highlight. So I'm going to remove some of this, and yes, it's going to look darker initially, but it won't in a minute when that dries. And then I can go back into it and work a little bit more. So a wet paper towel can do some really beautiful tones in softening this, and that's still a grattage technique. So don't be afraid of it. It doesn't have to all be rough and bumpy just because grattage sounds a little like a rough edge. It's not that. It's any kind of texture. So time to let this dry a little bit more. If you have a spray bottle, that is another technique that's kind of fun to try. So I'm going to just spray over some of my graphite here, get a new Q-tip, take a Q-tip, and just start moving my edges up. This is another way to press in and use the grattage technique to create texture. So I'm just trying to blur some of my edges along the background here. Charcoal would work really well with this too, but you have to be careful because charcoal being so dusty, just like pastels, it might overshoot the runway, so to speak, and you might wind up with too much dust and texture and your drawing might get obliterated. So it's something, if you're interested in experimenting, you can try. But you see here how the grattage, I'm lifting off pigment, I'm adding pigment, I'm creating an interesting surface, and I recognize my paper is a little bumpy from the water, but that will change once it's completely dry. If you want to dry a drawing paper, because it gets bumpy like this, just find a heavy book and lay it down till it's completely dry. I'd put a piece of paper towel or something over it so you don't damage the book. But it'll dry flat, believe it or not. Most of the time it will work, unless it's a super cheap drawing paper, and believe me, I've had my share of that. So this is grattage using a Q-tip, and I'm just softly going through the edges just to get a little bit of a textured effect like you can see here. Once you start playing around with this, you'll find even more things to do. So in this case, I took a little bit more paint, added it to the edge of my piece of aluminum foil, and just did this. I'm just dabbing this in because I want to create an idea of the internal Indian corn type thing here, that blue and yellow corn. So I have some blue and yellow paint, and I'm just dabbing it in. Again, grattage, all about creating texture, all about pressing and removing on the surface. And yes, you can paint and draw a drawing. It works. I've given the paper a chance to dry. And how do you know that the paper is dry? Put your hand over it, and if it feels colder on the part that was wet than it does on the other part of the dry paper, you'll know it's still not completely dry. If it's not completely dry, you run the risk of your pencil pulling up the paper as you go back over it to finish the drawing. Now, Grattage has allowed us to press in textures on our color side as well as subtle textures using the different techniques with the brush, the fan brush as a stencil almost, and then the Q-tips to pull things out. I also, if you recall on this part right here, used a very crinkled piece of plastic wrap over wet graphite and let it dry for a few minutes so that we got these thin little lines. What Grattage does for your drawing is allow you to create a surface that then when you draw back into it, gives you almost an etching-like precision on your lines that you wouldn't get otherwise because you've built up a surface with some texture. So what I'm going to do here is draw back in, see if I can move the camera just a little bit closer, there we go, with some of these thin lines and start to get the texture of what a corn husk might be doing back here, because as I recall from the drawing, this was lighter on this side. I'm also going to draw in the shape that I wanted to do to show the corn husk being partly opened but not fully opened, and do that lighter here. I'm also going to go into the stalk, that little tassel, and get some light up there. And then I can go back in with some of my different colors, maybe in this case some of the browns, just to give the idea of that sort of withered corn stalk that was just left to sit maybe just a tad too long. But again, these beautiful lines that I'm getting here, and you'll see them closer on the finished piece, would not be possible if I didn't already have a surface that had created some textures. In addition to going darker, I can also accentuate some of my Grattage textures by just coloring over them again. So where I knew I had some hints of yellow, I'm just making some little dots and kind of going back into it to create that surface. Once we get the textures in, we can just take a simple color, in this case I'll just use a bit of a green, and go the opposite direction. This is more of that same drawing technique to just knock this down a little bit. But you can see, little green lines here, how doing the Grattage helped us get some texture that we can then build back into and exploit for our benefit. So what about the graphite side? Well, again, with a white color pencil or white pastel or white charcoal pencil, now that this is dry, I can use this to get my highlights, and this little piece here has some beautiful twisty shapes that, because I have Grattage in here, I'm able to get some really nice thin lines that otherwise would be almost impossible to get the precision on that I'm looking for here. And this has a really nice bend to it. And then here, where I already had some of my darks, I can draw back over it. But because it's a smoother surface from the wet and the Grattage and the blending that we did here, it allows me to get some really nice chiseled edges. And I'm gonna leave some soft because we don't want everything to be exactly the same. Here, where we blended in a little bit and I'm transitioning the drawings, I'm just gonna ever so slightly use the white to kind of accentuate the difference. And then where this stalk is really green, I'm just gonna go back in and lighten that up so that we kind of have a blend between these two drawings where they're sort of transitioning from dark to light. There's a few other little elements here that I just want to make a little bit lighter. And then I think we're going to call it finished for this grattage lesson on how to use surface texture to make an interesting drawing. Grattage is not a technique in drawing that you're going to use every single time you do a drawing, but it is a good way to add in some elements of interest in maybe a drawing that you think might be coming too flat, too tight, too controlled, or whatever. So here's my finished duo drawing, one in black and white and one in color. And you can see how by doing grattage, we'll get really close here, you can get soft, subtle areas and then get these beautiful, almost etching-like lines because we were able to get some pressed texture using that plastic wrap, some of the scraping using the aluminum foil, and then using that little fan brush to get some nice soft textures as well. Don't be afraid to try it, and don't be afraid to experiment. If all you do is do some different textures on a blank sheet of paper, that's fine too. You might find that it becomes part of your arsenal, so to speak, in creating an interesting drawing of subject matter in future artwork as well. Of course, if you're a painter, this is really right up your alley. You can do so much with grattage and painting to really make your backgrounds more appealing, to unify the foreground and the background, to create those nice escapes where the subject matter sort of blends into your background. There's a whole host of things that painters can do. In the slideshow that follows, you're going to see how Max Ernst used grattage along with frottage from our last week's episode to create some gorgeous paintings, albeit some are in the surrealist style. Next week, we'll have another Anyone Can Paint, Draw, and Create. Till then, stop by the Art Center if you want to say hi, or we will see you next week with a new episode. Stay safe and be well, Vincent Hall.